The Call of the Wild by Jack London. Chapter 1. Into the North. Buck did not read the newspapers, so he did not know that trouble was brewing in Southern California. Not alone for himself, for every other strong dog with a thick coat. Because men had discovered a yellow metal called gold, and they were looking for big dogs strong enough to toil endlessly and resist the bitter cold. Buck lived in the home of Judge Miller in a sunny valley called Santa Clara. The house was hidden among the trees. The back of the house was even more spacious than at the front, and the grounds beautifully laid out with orchards and gardens. For the 4 years of his life, Buck has lived here in splendor. It was true that there were other dogs, but Buck was considering himself to be at the very top of everyone, and he ruled like a king during all these years. He was neither a house dog nor a kennel dog. The whole realm belonged to him. All the other dogs came and went. They weren't so important. They lived in the corners of the house or outside. Buck was not like the others. He escorted the judge's 2 daughters on long walks in the early morning or at sunset. He hunted and swam with the judge's sons and carried his grandchildren on his back. Buck was a mix of St. Bernard and Scotch Shepherd. His father, Elmo, a huge St. Bernard, had been the judge's loyal companion, and Buck did his best to follow in the way of his father. He was not a spoiled dog and had great pride. He enjoyed having hardened muscles. Hunting and other outdoor delights had kept down the fat and made his whole body strong. This was Buck in the fall of 1897, when men from all over the world began to rush for gold to Klondike, into the frozen north. But Buck did not read the newspapers, nor did he know that Manuel, one of the gardener's helpers, was a dangerous man. He had a love of gambling, and stupidly he had faith in a system. This meant he needed a great deal more money than his wages to support his habit of gambling along with his wife and children. Manuel worked for Judge Miller, but he always wanted to earn more money. So that day he thought, I can sell Buck. He's a strong dog, and somebody will pay a lot for him. When the judge and his sons were gone one night, Manuel put a rope around Buck's neck and took Buck out of the house quietly. They arrived at a flag station where a man was waiting for them. Money changed hands, and Manuel was smiling with the gambling money in his hand. But Buck was aggressive, and when the stranger tried to take the rope, Buck growled. Pull it sharply so he won't be able to breathe and will obey you, said Manuel to the man. Buck didn't like the stranger, so he started to bark. When the rope tightened, cutting off his breath, he flied violently at the man. The man seized him close by the throat, with a strong twist threw him into the baggage car of the train. Never in all his life had Buck been so badly treated. At last he fell to the ground, and his eyes closed. When he opened his eyes with the anger of a kidnapped king, he was in the train. He had often traveled with the judge, and he knew where he was. Although the man sprang for his throat, Buck was too quick for him and bit the man's hand. He hid his mangled hand from the baggage man who had come there hearing the sounds of fight between Buck and the man. Buck was being taken to San Francisco for his fits. After incessant choking, Buck was fitted with a brass collar and thrown into a narrow cage. Throughout the night he questioned why he was there. He hated the rope around his neck. He was also hungry and thirsty, and above all, his pride was deeply wounded. The conductor and the salon keeper were speaking about the money that had changed hands for this animal. All night long, Buck wanted the judge to come for him. The cage was switched to an express car that would ride for 2 days. Buck, nursing his wrath and his pride in his cage, wondered what it all meant. What did these strange men want from him? When they arrived in San Francisco, the men left Buck in the cage. The next morning, 4 other evil-looking men arrived, and they only laughed and poked sticks at him. His cage changed so many hands. He was lifted into a wagon, then a truck carried him upon a ferry steamer. He was passed into a great railway depot, and finally put into an express car. After a long time, finally they arrived in Seattle. 4 men carried his cage carefully, and in a house gave it to a man in a red sweater. Soon Buck was faced with the man in the red sweater, who broke him out of the cage. Buck was a real red-eyed devil with his great anger, but when he sprang onto the man, was struck by a club badly. This was a horrible first-time experience for Buck. His madness knew no boundary. His mouth was foaming, and with a furious glitter in his red eyes, Buck attempted to rush. But each time he rushed, he was beaten and bloodied. He had never been struck by a club in his life, and at last he could no longer rise. He had never suffered such pain before. He couldn't hear or see for a while. Later, when Buck woke up and looked at the red sweater, the man genially told him to mind his place, patted his head, and provided him with meat and water. Buck was beaten, not broken. He had learnt not to fight a club, and this was an important lesson in his life, and would never forget it. By the time Buck saw other dogs arrive and undergo the same process, he started to respect the red sweater, but he would not show affection. One day, a French-Canadian man came and caught sight of Buck. He thought that Buck was 1 in 1,000. The small man was called Perrault. "I can't believe. He is so big and seems really strong. How much do you want for Buck?" $300 for Buck," answered the man in the red sweater. "Buck is the perfect dog for the cold north, with his thick coat to protect him." He purchased him, along with Curly, a good-natured Newfoundland. He took the 2 dogs to a boat and turned over to Francois, another French-Canadian. Perrault and he were fair and intelligent men. On the boat they met 2 other dogs. The snow-white and big one, who was treacherously friendly, was called Spitz, and Dave, a disinterested dog, if there ever was one. Dave was eating, sleeping, and yawning between times. All he wanted was to be left alone, nothing more. Finally, the boat ended its journey, and Buck was puzzled at the cold mushiness on the ground. He thought it was a kind of white mud falling through the air. He sniffed and licked it curiously, but the others started to laugh at him. So he felt ashamed, but it was his first snow. Chapter 2. The Law of Club and Wild. Buck's first day on the Dia beach was nightmarish. Every hour he was feeling more disoriented, flung from civilization into the heart of wild and chaos. His sun-kissed lazy life was over. Here, there was neither rest, nor peace, nor safety. There were a lot of dangerous men everywhere. In fact, the dogs were wilder than the men. They weren't from the south. They were following the law of the club and fang. They were all savages. Buck had never seen dogs fight as these wolfish creatures fought, and his first lesson, in this cold place, came quickly. He would never forget this wild experience. Curly was the victim. They were camping near a wood store, and the good-natured Curly wanted to be friendly, so she barked quietly in her friendly way and made advances to a big husky dog. Suddenly, the other dog turned around and sprang at Curly. There was no warning, only a metallic clip of teeth. Curly's face was hurt badly. It was ripped open from eye to jaw. Meanwhile, 30 or 40 huskies ran to the spot and surrounded the 2 fighting dogs. They stood and watched quietly. It was the wolf manner of fighting, to strike and leap away. The dog took her down with efficient, quick technique. Buck couldn't comprehend that silent circle of the dogs. Curly rushed at the husky, but he stopped her next rush with his strong chest. She could never get up again. The other huskies ran at her, snarling and yelping, screaming with agony. She couldn't defend herself any more beneath the bristling mass of bodies. Buck was surprised that everything had happened so sudden, and he could only see Spitz laughing. In those 2 minutes, Curly was dead. only he saw Francois, swinging an axe, spring into the mess of dogs. Curly lay there lifeless in the bloody snow, torn to pieces. This scene often came back to Buck in his sleep, and from that time Buck hated Spitz more than anything in his life. He also learned that fair play did not exist, and he resolved that he would never go down. Once down, that was the end of you. Before Buck had recovered from the shock caused by the terrific death of Curly, he had another bad surprise. Francois put the harness on him. He had seen these straps and buckles put on horses at his home. Also, he had seen those horses work, so he realized that he was set to work. He would carry a load of firewood from the forest with the other dogs. "I know you don't like being harnessed, Buck," said Francois, "but you have to wear it. Then you can pull the sledge." The first time he was harnessed to the sledge, his dignity was hurt, but he was too wise to rebel. Though it was all new and strange, Buck did his best. Dave, who was an experienced wheeler, bit Buck's back legs whenever he made mistakes. Spitz, who was the leader of the dogs, growled sharply in order to make Buck do his work properly. Buck learned quickly from these two dogs, and Francois was very pleased. Buck returned to camp, knowing to stop at the cry, "Ho!" to go forwards at "Mush!" "These are good dogs," Francois told Parole. Buck learns very quickly, and he pulls very hard. By afternoon, Parole returned with 2 more huskies. Billy and Joe were 2 brothers, and true huskies both, but they were different as night and day. Billy was a good-natured dog, and this was a fault in the north. Joe was the very opposite, sour, with a perpetual snarl. Buck received them as comrades. Dave ignored them, while Spitz trashed about to demonstrate the hierarchy of the team. But no matter how Spitz circled, Joe whirled around on his heels to face him, ears laid back, lips moving in anger, and eyes diabolically shining. His appearance was so terrible that Spitz stopped his attack on him and turned upon the inoffensive and crying Billy to drive him away. By evening, Parole had got another husky, with single eye and battle-scarred face. He was an old dog. This new dog was called Solex, which means the angry one. Like Dave, he gave nothing, asked and expected nothing. He wasn't interested in anybody or anything, but other dogs respected him. Solex did not like to be approached on his blind side. Even Spitz left him alone when he marched slowly and deliberately into their midst. Buck, not knowing that, approached Solex in that way. Solex suddenly turned upon Buck and slashed his shoulder to the bone. Forever after, Buck kept away from his blind side and had no more trouble to the end of their comradeship. That night, when Buck tried to sleep, he was unable to find warmth. The tent looked warm in the midst of the white plain, but when he entered it, both Parole and Francois shouted angrily at him and threw cooking utensils, till he ran away into the outer cold. After wandering around the camp, he decided to see how the team was making out. The snow was wet and cold, and the wind hurt him. He looked for the other dogs, but he couldn't see them anywhere. With drooping tail and shivering body, he aimlessly turned around the tent, but suddenly the snow gave way beneath his front legs, and he sank down. He felt something moving quickly under his feet. He sprang back, growling with anger and frightened of the unknown and unseen. But a friendly little yelp erased all his fears, and the smell of warm air filled his nostrils, and there he came across Billy, curled up under the snow. Billy was a little ball under the snow, and he seemed comfortable and warm beneath the snow. Buck made his own hole and fell asleep instantly. The day had been long and hard, so Buck slept soundly. He growled and barked with bad dreams. He did not open his eyes till he was awakened by the noises of the waking camp. It had snowed all night, so he was totally buried. At first, he did not know where he was. The snow walls pressed his body on every side, and a strong fear, a wild animal's fear of being caught, ran through him. Before he landed on his feet, he saw the white camp spread out in front of him, so he knew where he was. Suddenly, he heard the shout of Francois. "What did I say?" Francois shouted to Perrault. "This dog for sure learns quickly." Perrault, being a courier for the Canadian government, was proud of possessing the best dogs, and he was especially pleased with Buck. Inside an hour, 3 more dogs were added to the team, and now there were 9 dogs. Before another quarter of an hour had passed, they were pulling the sledge toward the Dia Canyon. Buck was glad to be among the others, and although his work was hard, he was learning quickly. He also noticed that all passiveness and unconcern had disappeared from them. All of them, even Dave and Solex, were active and alert, anxious that the work should go well. Dave was the first dog nearest to the sledge. Pulling in front of him was Buck. Then came Solex. The rest of the team was strung as a single file to the leader. Spitz was at the front, leading all the dogs. Buck had been placed between Solex and Dave on purpose so that he might receive more instruction. These 2 strong dogs were also good teachers, although they were supporting their teaching with their sharp teeth. Dave was wise and fair. He never nipped Buck causeless, and he never failed to nip him when it was necessary for Buck. Once, during a brief stop, when he delayed the start, both Dave and Solex flew at him and nipped him. Francois didn't hit him so often, and Perrault even honored Buck by lifting up his feet and carefully examining them. It was a hard day's run up the canyon, through sheep camp, past the wood line, across rivers of ice. They reached in short time to the chains of lakes, and late that night pulled into the big camp at the head of Lake Bennett, where hundreds of gold seekers were building boats against the breakup of the ice in the spring. At the end of the day, Buck made his bed in the snow and fell asleep very quickly. But early next morning he was routed out in the cold darkness, and with his comrades was harnessed to the sledge. That day they made 40 miles, but the next day and following days there was no track, so they had to work harder and were not able to move as fast as before. Perrault usually was traveling in front of the dogs. He prided himself on his knowledge of ice, and this knowledge was very important. Some of the ice was very thin, and where there was flowing water, there was no ice at all. Day after day, Buck did his best on pulling the sledge. They always got up in the dark, hit the trail all day long. Always after dark they pitched camp, ate their bit of fish, and slept in the snow. Every night in camp, Buck was exhausted. He was eating his ration of fish ravenously. He was bigger than the other dogs, and he was always hungry. A piece of sun-dried salmon, which was his ration for each day, seemed to go nowhere. Also, he couldn't eat as quickly as the other dogs, so they frequently took his fish away from him. He could not defend his fish. While he was fighting 2 or 3, it was disappearing into the throats of the others. Buck lost all fastidiousness after he was robbed for eating slowly. After many days, Buck started to eat as fast as the others, and even started to take what did not belong to him. He watched and learned. When he saw Pike, one of the new dogs, steal a piece of bacon when Perrault turned his back, he duplicated the action of Pike by stealing a whole chunk of bacon the other day. He was not caught. Buck's theft marked him as fit to survive in the Northland environment. Property and personal feelings could no longer be respected. He was able to change himself to fit into changing conditions. If he had been unable to do this, he would have quickly died. He did things because it was easier to do them than not to do them. His development of heightened senses, callous muscles, and a hardened stomach was rapid. Buck had learned a new set of life skills. He wasn't the same dog. He was quicker, smarter, and stronger. He was there, in the wild north, because Manuel wanted money and men wanted gold. Now a new set of life skills instilled new life into him. He was a different dog, a wilder dog. On the still cold nights, Buck, with the other dogs, pointing their nose at a star, howled long and wolf-like, their ancestors. Their howls were voices of the very first wolves' trouble and sorrow. Buck thought that he had come back to the life of those who lived here and hunted in packs hundreds of years ago. He had come into his own world once more. Chapter 3. The Fight of Two Rivals. The beastie side of Buck's nature was growing stronger. It was a controlled and secret growth. Although he never picked fights, the hatred between him and Spitz raged darkly. Spitz was the most important dog because he knew the sledge best. But sensing a rival, Spitz never failed to show his teeth to Buck. The other dogs were afraid of him. But Buck was busy with changing himself to the new life to feel free from worry. He showed a certain carefulness in everything he did. He did not do anything without thought and quickly. He did nothing to make Spitz furious. On the other hand, Spitz divined in Buck a dangerous rival and even went out of his way to frighten Buck. He often tried to start the fight which could end only in the death of one or the other. He wanted to fight Buck because each day his rival got stronger and more dangerous. But Spitz had to be the best, so the only way was to kill Buck. At the end of this day, they stopped next to a great lake. It was cold and windy, so Buck made a warm bed in the snow. He did not want to leave his nest when Francois gave out the fish. But when Buck finished eating the fish and returned, he found his nest occupied by his enemy. A warning growl told him that it was Spitz. Till now, Buck resisted his fury, but this was too much. Spitz looked at Buck and laughed. The beast and Buck roared. He sprang upon Spitz with a fury which surprised both of them, especially Spitz. Till then, Spitz had believed that his rival was an unusually timid dog who was able to protect himself because of his great body. Francois was also surprised when he saw the two dogs fighting. "Fight him, Buck! Give it to him, by God!" shouted Francois. "Give it to him, the dirty thief!" Spitz was trying to get a chance to spring in, moving in a circle backwards and forwards, but the fight never finished, because Parole shouted. Everybody in the camp heard the sounds of Parole's club upon a bony frame, and a dog's shrill cry of pain. The camp was suddenly full of strange, starving, thin huskies. 4 or 5 of them had scented the camp from some Indian village. They pounced on the food, crazy by its smell. They had quietly entered the camp while Spitz and Buck were fighting. The team had never seen such dogs, gaunt skeletons with eyes and fangs. It seemed as though their bones would burst through their skin. Francois and Parole hit the dogs, but they didn't leave. As soon as they finished the food, they attacked the sledge dogs. Buck was beset by 3 huskies. His head and shoulders were ripped and bleeding. Billy was crying as usual. Solix and Dave, covered with bloody wounds, were fighting bravely against the devil huskies. Joe was attacking the dogs like a demon. Buck got one of the dogs by the throat, and when his teeth sank through the skin and got the warm taste of the blood, he became even fiercer. At the same time, he felt teeth sink into his own throat. It was Spitz, traitorously attacking him from the side. Francois and Parole hurried to save their sledge dogs. After they saved them, the 9 team dogs gathered together and sought shelter in the forest. Many of them were wounded in 4 or 5 places. Dub was badly hurt in a hind leg. Dolly, the last husky added to the team, was wounded from her throat. Joe had lost an eye, while Billy's ear was nearly cut off. In the morning, the dogs walked slowly back to the camp. They all looked very bad. "Oh, my friends," said Francois softly, looking over his poor wounded dogs. "Maybe you'll go crazy, because those dogs attacked you. Maybe you're crazy now. What do you think, Parole?" The courier shook his head doubtfully. There were still 400 miles between him and Dawson, so he could not stand the thought that madness might break out among his dogs. "They'll be fine," said Parole. "We have many days of work, so the dogs have to be all right." The 30-mile river was wide open. Its wild river wasn't frozen. Only in the quiet places there was ice. 6 days of exhausting work were required to complete those 30 terrible miles. Occasionally, they broke through the ice, and the dogs had to be thawed by a fire. Perrault was relentless. Each time he fell through the thin ice, he had to build a fire and dry his clothes in order to survive. Perrault couldn't be daunted, and he wanted to clear the 300 miles to Dawson as soon as possible. By the time they reached good ice, Buck's feet were in agony from the years of softened generations. But soon his feet hardened and became used to the 40 miles the team was covering daily. Francois had rubbed Buck's feet every night and had brought him his fish, as he couldn't go to take his supper. One morning, as they were harnessing up, Dolly, who had never been noticeable for anything, went suddenly mad. First she howled like a wolf and stopped in front of her harness, sitting down, then sprang straight for Buck. He had never seen a dog go mad, nor did he have any reason to fear madness. But he knew that here was something horrible and fled from it. Dolly was only one jump behind him. He ran through the trees, across some ice, and back to the river. Dolly, panting and frothing, barked crazily behind him, but she couldn't reach and catch him. Finally, Francois called to him a quarter of a mile away, and Buck, putting all his faith in that Francois would save him, ran through Francois. He held an axe in his hand, and as Buck's shot passed him, the axe came down very hard on Dolly's head. Buck fell near the sledge, exhausted and helpless. It was Spitz's turn. He sprang upon Buck, and twice his teeth sank into his foe, ripped to the bone. Then Francois's rip descended, and Buck watched with satisfaction Spitz receive the worst whipping he had ever seen. "That Spitz is a devil," said Perrault. "Some day he'll kill Buck." "That Buck is like 2 devils," replied Francois. "All the time I watch Buck, and I know. Some day Buck will get really furious and chew that Spitz. Sure, I know." From then on it was war between Buck and Spitz. The weather got warmer and the journey got even more difficult. There was no time for fighting, but it was inevitable that the clash for leadership between Buck and Spitz should come. Buck warned to be the new leader because it was his nature. Everyone seemed to know that the fight was drawing nearer. Spitz feared the possible supremacy of Buck because he sensed Buck's pride in the work. He stood up to Spitz and protected the dogs who had made mistakes. One night there was a heavy snowfall, and in the morning Pike, the laziest dog among the group, did not appear. He was hidden in his nest under a foot of snow. Although Francois looked for him for a long while, all his calls were in vain. Spitz was wild with wrath. Smelling and digging in every place, he searched for him. Finally he snarled so frightfully that Pike heard and shook in his hiding place. When Spitz found Pike and jumped fiercely at him to punish him, Buck flew with the same anger in between. Pike, who had been trembling with fear, gained courage at this event and sprang upon Spitz. Buck also did the same, but this frightening attack came to an end when Francois brought his whip down upon Buck with all his strength. In these days that followed, Buck continued to interfere when Spitz was disciplining other dogs. The solidarity of the group was destroyed as a mutinous faction rised against the overthrown leader. The other dogs began to disobey him and lose their respect for him. Francois knew the life and death struggle between the 2 dogs must take place sooner or later, and he was living in fear of this. After many more days on the river, they reached Dawson. Everybody was exhausted. There were many men and dogs, and they were all working. All day they swung up and down the main street in long teams. Buck met here Southland dogs. They were the wild wolf husky breed. Every night, regularly, at 9, at 12, at 3, they howled at the night sky, and it was a strange song that Buck really enjoyed to join in. With the northern lights flaming coldly overhead, or the stars dancing, and the land frozen under its bed of snow, this song of the huskies put into words the pain and sorrow of living. It was an old song, old as the wolf breed itself. The sorrow of thousands of years was in this song. When he lifted his head and howled at the stars, he felt that mystery, and he had gone back through time to the beginnings of life. 7 days later, they had reached Dawson, and the dogs were stronger now, so the fighting quickly began again. They stopped at a step bank to the Yukon Trail and set out for Daya and Saltwater. Perrault was carrying mail, which was more urgent than he brought to Dawson before. Later on their journey was easier. In 2 or 3 places, the police had prepared stores of food, both for dog and man, so Perrault didn't have to carry so many things. Every day, Buck had small fights with Spitz, and he always fought him in front of the other dogs. Now the dogs could see that Buck was stronger and more dangerous than Spitz, so one by one they started to stop respecting their leader. The baking down of discipline affected the dogs in their relations with one another. They began to work badly, and they didn't pull the sledge well. Francois shouted at them angrily, "You stupid dogs!" and hit them again and again, but it didn't stop fighting between them. One night after supper, Dub saw a rabbit. The rabbit was too fast for him, so he missed it. In a second, the whole camp, nearly 50 dogs, huskies all, joined the chase. The rabbit ran down the river and then turned off into a small bay and ran lightly on the surface of the snow. Buck was in front of the other dogs. He was very excited. He wanted to catch the animal and kill it to become the new leader of the group. All that old instincts which at certain periods drives men out from big cities to forests and plains to hunt things, the lust for blood, the joy to kill, all this was Buck's. He was running at the head of the pack, hunting the wild thing down, the living meat, to kill with his own teeth and wash his mouth in warm blood. Buck, howling like a wolf, running after the food that was alive and that fled before him through the moonlight. But Spitz, cold and calculating, left the pack to take a different route to head off Buck before he could reach the rabbit. Buck didn't see him. Suddenly, Spitz jumped out in front of the animal. The rabbit couldn't turn around, and Spitz's big teeth sank into his throat and killed it quickly. Although the other dogs barked and howled, Buck didn't stop. He sprang onto Spitz, shoulder to shoulder, began their last and deadly fight. In a flash, Buck knew it. It was to the death. The time had come. As they circled about, carefully watching each other, ears laid back and growling angrily, the scene came to Buck familiar as he had already known it before. Spitz fought very well, and he attacked Buck again and again. He had fought many times before, from Spitzbergen through the Arctic and across Canada. His anger was devilish, and he was mastered by his strong feelings to tear and destroy. Buck tried without success to bite the neck of the big white dog. He tried to push Spitz onto the ground, but the enemy always jumped away very quickly. Buck had many cuts, but Spitz was fine. The other dogs watched him carefully as he was wounded and exhausted. As a final attack, Buck sprang onto Spitz and closed his teeth around Spitz's leg. There was a crunch of breaking bone. Despite the pain and helplessness, Spitz struggled madly to keep up. When Buck repeated the trick, Spitz's, the other foreleg was broken too. There was no hope for him. He saw the silent circle with gleaming eyes fixed upon him. Every animal was turned to stone. Only Spitz tried to walk, growling fiercely as though to frighten off threatening death. Then Buck sprang for the last time and hit him hard. Spitz cried and fell. The dark circle, becoming a dot, moved forwards at him, and Spitz disappeared from view. Buck sat down and watched. He was very tired, but he felt good, as now he was the most important dog, the successful leader. Chapter 4. The winner of the mastership. Hey, what did I say? It was true when I said that Buck was like 2 devils. This was what Francois said next morning when he discovered that Spitz was missing, and he praised Buck. Buck was covered with wounds. Perrault looked at Buck's cuts and said, "Spitz fought hard. And now the sledge will travel faster. No more Spitz, no more trouble. That's for sure," replied Francois. Then Perrault looked at the sledge and Francois harnessed the dogs. Buck walked to the place Spitz would have occupied as boss of the team. But Francois, not noticing him, brought Solex to the place at the front of the dogs. At that time, Buck sprang upon his rival angrily, driving him back and taking his place. "Ha!" Francois cried. "Look at Buck. He killed Spitz, and he stands in his place. Get out of there, Buck!" he shouted, but Buck refused to move. Then Francois took Buck by his neck and replaced Solex to the same place. But Solex was afraid of Buck, and he wasn't willing to be at the front of the team. When Francois turned his back, Buck again took the leader's place. Francois was really angry with him and retaliated by bringing in a heavy club. "Now, by God, I will place you somewhere," shouted Francois. Bitterly snarling, but remembering his lesson at the hands of the man in the red sweater, Buck stayed just out of reach. He didn't manage to attack when Solex was brought forward. Both men attempted to catch him, but Buck would not relent. He wanted the leadership, so he walked round in a circle just beyond the range of the club, snarling with fierce anger. After some time, Francois bored up with trying to catch and replace Buck in his old place. He threw the club and made a place for Buck in front. This was his right. He had won it, and he wouldn't be satisfied with less. Laughing, the victor took his rightful place. Francois put him in his new harness. The team was harnessed to the sledge in a line, ready to go. The sledge started off, and they ran quickly through the frozen river. After some kilometers, Francois thought, "Buck is better than Spitz. He's stronger, faster, and more intelligent than him. Now Buck is better than the best dog." Later, Buck managed to stop the fighting between the other dogs. Dave and Solex did not mind the change in leadership. They were totally concentrated on their hard work. Billy, the good-natured, could lead for all they cared. The rest of the team had been unruled during the last days of Spitz, and now they were surprised with Buck's authority. Day by day, he excelled at leading, whipping the rest of the team into shape. Pike, who never put an ounce more of his weight, in the first day of Buck's leadership, pulled more than ever in his life. The first night in camp, Joe was punished and beaten by Buck, until he began to whine for mercy. Soon the team recovered its old-time solidarity. One evening, 2 new dogs, Teak and Kuna, were added to the team. They reached to a good speed in such a short time with Buck's training that both Perrault and Francois were surprised. "I've never seen such a dog as that Buck," said Francois. "He's worth $1,000. Perrault shook his head and agreed with what he said. He was reaching the record time for the journey, thanks to their new leader. The ice was hard, and there was no new fallen snow. It wasn't so cold either. For 14 days, every day they ran 20 kilometers. On the last night of the second week, they reached the goal of Skagway in record time. Everyone asked them to drink, and the crowd of dog drivers in the town were respectful to the team. But next came official orders. Francois called Buck to him, put his arms around Buck's neck, and wept over him. And this was the last time with Perrault and Francois. Soon they had to sell the dogs. A Scotch half-bred took care of Buck and the other dogs in the team. In company with 12 other dogs, Buck started on the long journey to Dawson. The Scotch and some other men were working for the Canadian Mail Company, so the work was now strictly toilsome, pulling the mail carts back over the trail to Dawson. They carried news from the world to the men who were seeking gold under the shadow in the freeze of the North Pole. For Buck, life was monotonous. Feeding time each day was a battle of quickness. But he took pride in his work, like Dave and Solex. He also achieved quick mastery over the other dogs. The best part of the day was when the dogs were fed. It was also good for them to stand around for an hour together, although they were fierce fighters. But soon Buck gained respect and reached the mastery after 3 battles with the fiercest. Later, when he showed his teeth and bristled, each member of the team got out of his way. Best of all, Buck liked to lie by the fire at night, watching dreamily at the burning wood, before he went to sleep. Sometimes he thought of Judge Miller and his big house in the sun-kissed Santa Clara Valley. But now his memories of his California home were faded and dim. In his dreams, he often remembered the man in red sweater, the death of Curly, the big fight with Spitz, and the good things he had eaten or would like to eat. He didn't want to go back to Judge Miller's house. Those memories had no power over him. More often, he was visited by visions of an ancient life, his place with the first humans to appear on Earth. In these dreams, Buck himself looked primitive. He was the constant companion of a man in the battle of survival. Old instincts became alive again. After many more days, they reached in Dawson. It was a hard journey, with the heavy mail behind them, and this hard work wore them down. They were all tired, weak, and thin. They should have a week's rest at least. But after 2 days, the team reversed direction once again from Dawson to Yukon, loaded with letters for the outside. The dogs couldn't run fast as they were exhausted. Their strength was quickly waning, yet the drivers did their best for the team. Each night they ate before the drivers and the men went to sleep, only after they examined the feet of the dogs which they drove. Buck bore up to all those long miles that they had traveled since the beginning of the winter. He also kept the other dogs up to their work, although he was so tired too. As it snowed every day, the sledge got heavier and heavier. It was the dogs' third trip back to Skagway, and they had traveled 1,800 miles since the beginning of the winter. Day after day, dogs had more problems. Billy cried often while he was sleeping, and Joe was sourer than ever, and Solex did not allow anyone to approach him. But Dave was the biggest problem, and he suffered most of all. Sometimes the sledge stopped suddenly, and Dave cried with pain. Something had gone wrong with him. He was easily made angry, and he became sour like Joe. The men looked at him carefully, but they couldn't find the problem. All the drivers were wondering what was happening to him. One night they brought Dave from his nest to the fire. They examined his legs, but something was wrong inside, not with his legs, so they couldn't help him. After 3 days, Dave was so weak that he was falling to the ground in the harness repeatedly. At last, the Scottish man stopped the sledge and took him out of his harness, but he refused to stop pulling the sledge. He begged with his eyes to remain there, but when he saw Solex being put into his place, he cried sadly, and he struggled with Solex at the side in the soft snow while the team was trying to pull the sledge. Dave refused to run quietly behind. The men tried to drive him away with the whip, and finally Dave fell down and lay where he fell. He was crying sadly as the long train of sledges passed by. He walked slowly behind the sledge and cried. The dogs had to have a short rest, so the men stopped. Then they set off quickly and easily. But when they turned their heads, they stopped in surprise. The driver called his friends to see the sight. Dave had bitten through the harness and was standing in his proper place in front of the sledge. A friend of the driver said, "Some dogs die because they can't work. The sledge dogs, when they can't pull the sledge, they don't want to live anymore." So the Scottish man, who knew Dave was on his deathbed, didn't leave him behind. During his final pull, he often fell and was caught in the traces of the sled. But he succeeded in pulling the sledge till they reached the camp. But the next morning he was too weak to rise. He first moved his front legs forward and moved his body slightly, but finally his strength left him. He lay on the snow. The sledge went behind some trees, and the Scottish man stopped the dogs. He thought, "I have to help Dave. He'll die slowly in the cold snow, and it's not fair. He was a good dog." He walked back to Dave, and then they heard the sound of a gun. That was the last time the other dogs saw of him. The Scottish man came back quickly and shouted, "Mush!" Buck and everyone else knew what had taken place behind the trees. Chapter 5. A Deadly Journey. The Canadian mail sledge, with Buck and the other members of the team, arrived at Skagway after 30 days' journey from Dawson. All the dogs were in wretched state. They were totally worn out. After 30 days without a rest, Buck's weight of 140 pounds had gone down to 115. The others were lighter dogs, and they had lost more weight than Buck. Solex could no longer walk properly, and Dub was suffering from a painful shoulder. They were all footsore, barely able to move. "Come, my friends," said the driver. "We'll have a very long rest. This is the end." The dogs, shaking their bodies, their feet fell heavily to the ground. They were dead tired. It was not the same as being tired from working hard. It was the dead tiredness which comes after months of hard work and slow loss of strength. Months of constant toil had depleted their strength and dissolved their muscle fibers. The reason of their tiredness was this: they had traveled 2,500 miles in less than 5 months. So when they reached Skagway, they were on their last legs. They had reached the end of their strength. But the men had to buy new and strong dogs, so the Scottish men sold Buck and the other dogs. They were sold to 2 men from the States, Charles and Hal, and the Scottish men didn't ask for a lot of money because the dogs couldn't work very hard. There, in Klondike, all the useless ones were to be sold. 3 days passed. Buck and the other dogs found how totally tired and weak they were. Charles was 45 years old, and he had weak and watery eyes and a weak lip. Hal was a younger man of about 20, and he wasn't a kind man. Hal was always carrying a big gun and a hunting knife on his belt. The most important thing about him was this belt, and it showed a callousness which was unutterable. In their new owner's camp, Buck saw that everything was dirty and in disorder. He also saw a woman. The men called her Mercedes. She was Hal's sister and Charlie's wife, a nice family party. Buck watched them working hard, taking down the tent and load the sledge. But they did the work badly. The tent was rolled so badly that it was 3 times as large as it should have been. Buck watched everything apprehensively as they clumsily took down the camp. "Mush! Go! Move!" shouted Hal to the dogs. "Now go away!" The dogs jumped and tried to move the sledge, but it was too heavy with the clothes bag, with all those plates, and the other bags that they couldn't move it. 3 men from the neighbor tent came out and looked on, smiling at one another, and said, "You've already got a good load. You must leave that tent behind." The other man said, "Those dogs are tired. They want a rest." But Hal shouted, "You stupid dogs! You aren't pulling hard! I'll kill you!" Mercedes threw up her hands in alarm, and she said, "How could I travel without a tent?" "It's springtime and you won't get any more cold weather," the man answered. Mercedes didn't listen to the warning, but the team couldn't move the sledge. They were repeatedly whipped by Hal, as Mercedes was crying over them. Buck, from the beginning, didn't like her, but tolerated her pleading pats. "Mush!" shouted Hal. "Mush on there!" shouted Hal, and the dogs sprang forward, pulled hard for a few moments, but then stopped. "The lazy dogs, I'll show them!" he shouted, but Mercedes cried, "Oh, Hal, you mustn't!" So she caught the whip and pulled it away from Hal. Her brother laughed. "What do you know about dogs?" he said. "They'll not get a rest." Hal's whip fell upon the dogs, and then when the sledge finally moved, the road suddenly turned left, and the large sledge fell over. Bags and boxes went everywhere. Then the harnesses broke from the sledge, and the dogs did not stop. They ran away. Many people came and helped them to find their things and bring the dogs back. The dogs were angry because they had been treated badly. The men told Hal and Charles to travel with half the load and twice the number of dogs if they ever wanted to reach Dawson. Finally, superfluous luxuries were removed amidst Mercedes' tears, and more dogs were added to the team. Now the load was cut in half, but it was still very heavy. With 6 more dogs, Hal and Charles brought the team up to 14. But the new dogs did not seem to know anything. They weren't very good. So the journey began. Late next morning, Buck led the dog team up the street, and all the dogs worked as hard as they could. But Buck had covered this distance 4 times before, and knew this distance between Saltwater and Dawson. Covering this once more made him angry. There was no life in him or in his fellows. His heart was not in his work. nor was the heart of any dog. According to Buck, the team could not depend on these people as they were doing their work inefficiently and crudely. They didn't know about this cold country. It took them half night to make a camp and half the morning to load the sledge. During the rest of the day, they had to stop often to arrange the load again, as they had loaded the sledge so badly. And they never succeeded in covering more than half the distance which they had intended to cover. On the trip back to Dawson, Hal, Charles, and Mercedes fought every day. As they didn't have any plans, they also didn't know much about dogs, and they didn't bring much food for them. Too soon the dog food became short, and this was the worst of all. In 1 week, 6 dogs died, and the other dogs were almost dead. It was a beautiful spring weather. The birds sang and the trees were green again. The ice on the river started to break. Each day the sun rose earlier and set later, but no one took notice of these beautiful spring days. Mercedes no longer considered the dogs, because she was tired and she began to ride on the sledge all the time. She was a pretty woman, but weighed 120 pounds. It was too much weight to be pulled by the weak and hungry animals. Hal believed that others must learn to grow hard, so with his club in his hand, he ended by trying to beat the dogs, and at last the dog food totally finished. For Buck it was a nightmare. Through it all he struggled at the head of the team, but he could no longer pull the sledge properly. When he fell down and remained down, the blows of the whip and the club drove him to his feet again. All the stiffness and gloss had gone out of his beautiful furry coat, and his coat was struck together with dried blood in the places where Hal's club had bruised him. His muscles were disintegrated. One day Billy, the good-natured, fell and could not rise. Hal no longer had his gun, so with an axe he knocked Billy on the head. On the next day, only 5 of the dogs remained. Joe, Pike, Sol-Lex, Teak, and Buck were nearly dead. Poor Buck, still at the head of the team, but blind with weakness half the time, and following the path by the feel of his feet. Buck and his companions knew that this thing was very close to them. From every side came the music of running water. Air holes formed, and the cracks in the ice sprang and spread apart. Buck and the other dogs had no life in them when they arrived, one evening, at John Thornton's camp. When the sledge stopped, all of the dogs looked dead, and they fell down in the snow. While John Thornton was finishing an axe which he made, Hal started to talk. "What's the best way to Dawson?" asked Hal. Thornton gave simple replies, as he knew what kind of people they were, and he was certain that his advice would not be followed. "The weather is warmer now, and the ice is very thin," said Mr. Thornton, and continued, "Don't walk across this river to Dawson now." Hal refused to listen, and he replied, "We're going to finish our trip. We'll get to Dawson." Thornton didn't intend to stop them because he knew that they didn't understand the North. Only the merciless lashing of his whip could make any of them rise. But Buck remained on the ground. It was the first time he failed. So Hal took up the club, but Buck wouldn't move. He was too numb. Suddenly, John Thornton sprang upon Hal and drove him back, telling him that he would be killed if he hit Buck one more time. Hal tried to retaliate and got his knuckles slashed for his troubles. Hal couldn't fight Thornton. He was tired, and Buck was almost dead, so he decided to leave Buck behind. John cut Buck's traces, and the team proceeded. Buck watched the heavy sledge with the men and the dogs. Thornton sat down next to Buck, with his kindly hands searching for broken bones. He could find nothing wrong except for many wounds and a great hunger. The sledge moved slowly across the river. Suddenly, Buck saw the back of the sledge drop down into a small hole. He heard Mercedes shout and the dogs bark. Then a large piece of ice broke and dogs and people disappeared from view. Buck never saw them again. Thornton and Buck looked at each other. Buck ran his tongue along his new master's hand. "Oh, Buck," said Thornton quietly and lovingly. Chapter 6. For the Love of a Man. Having frozen his feet past December, John was walking with a slight limp. So his friends had made a camp for him, and they had left him by the river. Day by day, Buck slowly gained back his strength. In the camp, Buck sat and watched the river. He also listened to the songs of the birds. Buck, Thornton, and his other dogs all got stronger. Skeet was a little friendly Irish setter who early on made friends with Buck. She had the doctor trait which some dogs possess, and as a mother cat washes her kittens, she washed and cleansed Buck's cuts. Nig was a very large black dog, with eyes that laughed, and he was equally friendly. Buck's love for Thornton got stronger and stronger. The dogs manifested no jealousy toward Buck. He was welcome into their frolicking games. The kindness of John had extended to them, and Buck loved him more than anything in life. He felt love for the first time. Besides being kind, John Thornton was the ideal master. His dogs were his children. He was talking to them for long periods of time. He was grasping Buck's head and resting his own upon it. At times, Buck feared to let John out of sight. He was thinking that he would lose him as he had lost other masters. Moreover, this man had saved his life. Despite this great love, however, the strain of the primitive had remained alive and active in Buck. He was a wild dog who was sitting by John Thornton's fire. Thornton's friends, Hans and Pete, arrived in the camp with their boat. In the beginning, Buck didn't like these strange men, but then saw Thornton's love for them and respected them. Hans and Pete were talking about Buck, one saying to another, "Buck really loves Thornton, but I'm afraid. You know the men in the north. Sometimes they get angry easily, and they like to fight. And when something hurts John, Buck will go crazy," replied Pete. It was at Circle City, in December, when Pete remembered those words. Thornton and his friends were in a bar. Black Burton, an evil man, had been attempting to quarrel with someone at the bar when Thornton stepped between Black and the smaller man. Barton turned around and hit Thornton very hard in the face. Buck sprung in at once. The people in the bar heard a loud, angry bark. Buck attacked directly to Burton, and Burton shouted with pain. Then some men was upon Buck, and he was driven off. But while the surgeon checked the bleeding, Buck was still growling furiously outside. The miners discussed Buck, whether he was guilty or not. But in the end, they decided that the dog had sufficient provocation, and Buck was discharged. The second time that he saved John Thornton's life was in the fall of the year. The three partners were lining a long and narrow boat down a bad stretch of rapids on the 40-mile creek. Buck, on the bank, anxious and worried, kept abreast of the boat, his eyes never off his master. Suddenly, the boat moved very quickly through the water, and it hit a rock. The boat turned over, and Thornton fell into the cold water. The water was very fast, and Thornton was shouting for help. Buck jumped into the water and swam to his friend. But at his first intention, he couldn't save his master, as the water was very fast. Thornton shouted, "You can't pull me to Hans and Pete! Go, Buck, go!" But Buck didn't want to leave his friend, and jumping out of the water, he ran fast to a place above his master, and he intended to save him again with a rope around his body. He swam to Thornton, and Thornton caught him around his neck. Hans at once pulled the rope, as though Buck were a boat. The rope pulled him under the water, and when he was lifted out, Buck was half drowned. Hans and Pete threw themselves upon him, beating the breath into him and the water out of him. Finally, the sound of his master's voice turned him to life. He sprang to his feet. Thornton decided to make a camp there, and they camped till Buck's 3 broken bones healed, and he was able to walk down the river to Dawson. Later that winter in Dawson, Buck achieved another great thing for his master, which made his name more famous. This achievement was particularly gratifying to the 3 men, for they were enabled to start out on a long-desired journey into the Virgin East, where miners had not yet appeared. It was brought about by a conversation in the El Dorado saloon, in which a few men were talking with great pride about their best dogs. These men attacked Buck because of his record, and Thornton was driven stoutly to defend him. Suddenly, one man said, "I have a very strong dog. He can pull a sledge with 200 kilos of sugar on it." A second man said his dog could pull 300 kilos of sugar on it. "Poof, poof," said John Thornton. "Buck can start a sledge with 450 kilos of sugar on it. Can he walk off with it for 100 meters? Demanded another man in the saloon, called Mathewson. He can walk off with it for 100 meters, replied Thornton coldly. Well, Mathewson said slowly, I'll give you $1,000, or you have to give me $1,000, okay? Said Mathewson clearly, so that all could hear. As he spoke, he threw a small bag of gold on the table. I have a sledge outside now, and it has 450 kilos of sugar on it. Mathewson continued. No one spoke. Thornton knelt down by Buck's side, and he could feel the warm blood rising up his face. The great weight frightened him, but he whispered in Buck's ear, As you love me, Buck, as you love me. The crowd was watching curiously. Further, he had not got $1,000, nor had Pete or Hans. The face of Jim O'Brien, an old friend of Thornton, caught his eyes. Can you give me $1,000? He asked quietly. Sure, answered O'Brien, putting down a bag of gold by the side of Mathewson's. Though I've got little faith, John, that the beast can do the trick. Several hundred men stood around and waited for Buck to pull the sledge. They were really excited. They talked about Buck's test and about the money. Thornton, bringing Buck to Mathewson's sledge, put on his harness. Buck was now strong and beautiful. Then Thornton stood up and walked away from his dog. Now, Buck, mush! He shouted. His master's command affected Buck like a shot from a gun. He threw himself forward and pulled hard, but it was a very difficult job. His whole body was low to the ground, his head forward and down, while his feet were flying like mad on the hard snow. The sledge swayed and trembled, half started forward. It moved 1 centimeter and then 2 centimeters. The short, quick movements now became one continuous movement. Thornton was running behind, encouraging Buck with cheery words. Although Buck was exhausted, he didn't stop. Slowly, he walked to the end of the distance. Men gasped and began to breathe again. Hats and mittens were flying in the air. Men were shaking hands. Thornton fell on his knees beside Buck. Head against head, he started to curse Buck lovingly. From that moment, everybody started to talk about Buck as the most wonderful dog in Alaska. Chapter 7. The Sounding of the Call. When Buck won the bet in 5 minutes for John Thornton, he showed his strong love for his master and allowed John to go on a journey with his 2 friends into the east to search for a lost mine. The history of the mine was as old as the history of the country. Many men had sought it, few had found it, and many of the searchers had never returned from the quest. Dying men had talked about it, showing the rocks of gold in their hands that were unlike any known type of gold in the Northland. When they started their journey, they weren't afraid of these stories. John was a man unafraid of the wild. Buck led a team of 7 dogs 70 miles up the Yukon. John could shoot what he wanted without hurrying. So, on this great journey, men and dogs ate fresh meat. Buck was enormously delighted with this endless fishing and hunting, with the wonderful days on the trail. They went down new rivers, slept on new mountains. Buck also loved going to these new and exciting places. With a sledge, some dogs and rifles, these men could live anywhere in the wild. The months came and went. Spring came on once more, and at the end of their wandering they never found the way reaching to the lost hut that they had seen from a valley. But they did find a broad valley where the gold showed like yellow butter across the bottom of the stream. The men worked hard. Day after day they took the gold from the bottom of the stream and put it into large bags. Every day they got richer and richer, but there was nothing for the dogs to do except muse by the fire. The lack of work caused Buck to spend long hours dreaming by the fire, remembering his wild instincts. When they walked by the seashore, Buck looked everywhere for hidden danger and was prepared to attack like the wind at the first sign. In his mind, he wandered in his early, undefined world. The call of the wild was close to him. He didn't understand this new place, but he felt very happy. He started to feel something strange inside, and sometimes he could hear a strange voice. One night, he suddenly sprang from sleep. The call came from the forest. This call was a clear, long-drawn howl. The howl was unlike any noise made by a dog, but to Buck this sound was familiar. Finally, he couldn't resist longer to the call, and he drew closer to the cry, moving very slowly and carefully. There he came upon a timber wolf. He had made no noise, yet the wolf ceased howling. Buck, with every movement of him, showed a strange mixture of threatening power and a desire for friendship, but the wolf growled fiercely and showed its teeth. Buck did not attack, but walked round the wolf in a circle and hedged him in with friendly advances. In the end, Buck succeeded, for the wolf, finding that no harm was intended, sniffed noses with Buck. Then they became friendly and ran together through the forest. When Buck stopped for water, suddenly remembered John Thornton. Slowly he made his way back to the camp, as his wild brother howled mournfully at his departure. For an hour the wild brother ran by his side. Then he sat down, pointed his nose to the sky, and howled again. When Buck ran into camp and sprang upon him, John Thornton was eating his dinner. His master cursed him lovingly, and for 2 days Buck never left the camp and never let Thornton out of his sight. But after 2 days in the camp, the call was too much to ignore. Once he went down into the land of the wild forests and streams. He slept away 4 days at a time. He delighted in catching his food as he needed it, hunting and killing those who cannot fight against him. Only the splashes of brown and white on his muzzle and chest betrayed the fact that he was not a wolf. He was vibrant. Never had he been in such peak form. His instincts and reflexes were incredibly sharp. John and his friends knew there had never been such a dog. When he left the camp, he transformed into a thing of wild. He was a killer, a thing that killed to eat, living on the things that lived. And he killed alone, without help, by his own strength. Because of all this, he began to gain a great pride in himself. It showed itself in all his movements. One of his biggest triumphs was taking down a large moose by himself. Buck had developed the patience of the wild. He had waited 4 days for his prey to relent. He attacked a big and angry moose fiercely from all sides until the moose became tired out. Buck didn't let him go with the other mooses, and he followed the big moose everywhere. The others could not wait so long as Buck could wait. The great moose watched the rest of the band continue on their rapid journey, and at the end he faced death at the teeth of a creature whose head did not reach beyond his great knees. For a day and a night, Buck stayed by the dead animal. He ate and slept, then he went back to the camp to see his friend Thornton. 3 kilometers from the camp, Buck started to feel very strange. He felt something was wrong in the camp, so he started to run, and upon arriving back at the camp, he found disaster. Nig, his little doctor, had a large arrow in his back, and he was dead. Then he found Hans, with arrows in his back. He was dead too. A loud, angry bark came from Buck, but he didn't hear it. For the last time in his life he went crazy. The Indians were dancing about the remains of the small hut when they heard a strange and terrible cry. They saw Buck rushing upon them. He sprang at the nearest man, who was the chief of the Indians. In a second he cut the man's throat wide open with his sharp teeth. Then it was the second man's turn. Buck killed him in a second. As he was moving so quickly, with their arrows, the Indians couldn't do anything to this wild animal. Then the Indians turned and fled in terror to the woods. It was a day the Indians would never forget, because they had to run far and wide over the country. And it was not until a week later that a few of them gathered together and counted their losses. Tired of the pursuit, Buck returned to the camp. Everyone has been shot and killed with feathered arrows. Pete was dead in his bed. Buck walked to the river of gold. Its color had turned red, and Thornton was under the water. Buck couldn't see him, but he knew John was dead. He sat by his master's body and contemplated the ache in the heart. In spite of his sadness, there was pride. He had conquered man, the noblest game of all. And with John Thornton's death, there was nothing to hold him to mankind. Now he could no longer play with his friend or look into his eyes with love. The sun went down and the sounds of night came to him. When Buck heard a chorus of howls in the forest that night, he ran to wait for them. Buck only loved one man, Thornton, and now he was dead. Now Buck didn't want the harness or the work of men. The pack of wolves came upon him. The boldest one struck Buck and instantly had his neck broken. The rest of the wolves descended, but Buck held them off for half an hour. So the wolves drew back, discomfited. Suddenly, Buck recognized his wild brother, and they sniffed noses. When the pack howled, Buck joined them. They embraced him in a half-friendly, half-savage manner. Finally, Buck ran with them into the woods, next to his wild brother. He answered the call of the wild. But the story of Buck doesn't end here. A couple of years later, the Indians noted some different wolves, with their brown marks on their heads and a line of white down the center of the chest. They also tell of a ghost dog that runs at the head of the pack. They are afraid of this ghost dog that haunts the woods and slays the bravest hunter. The story grows worse. There are hunters who can't return to camp, and there have also been hunters who have been found with their throats cut wide open and with giant wolf marks near them in the snow. People say that every summer the river of gold that people stay away has one visitor. He is a great, beautiful wolf, but not a wolf. He comes out of the green woods. He howls once, mournfully, before rejoining his pack. He sings a song of a younger world, which is the song of the pack.